Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this National Review Institute's first in a series of Free to Foster Fridays. And today we're going to talk about primarily the Supreme Court case that was heard the morning after the first election day. Understandably, a lot of people weren't paying attention, but it's a critical case, not just for religious liberty. It's being argued by the Becket Funds for Religious Liberty against the city of Philadelphia, but for the lives of children. And that's really why we're here today. I'm Kathryn Lopez from the National Review Institute, and I'm joined here by Naomi Schaefer Riley from the American Enterprise Institute, who is the expert right now on these issues, on both right and left, frankly. Whenever I want to know any answer to a foster care or adoption question, I ask her, but it's not just me, it's people who have been in this area for a long time. So Naomi, thank you for joining me, and thank you for this vocational work you're doing at this point in your life. It's really beautiful and powerful.
Thanks for having me, Kathryn. It's nice to be able to talk to you about this issue on a regular basis.
Yeah, we're a little overdue. It's been a couple of months, so so we have to get to it. So what? Well, first of all, this case is about the city of Philadelphia ending a contract with Catholic Social Services at a time where the city of Philadelphia had announced there was an opioid crisis. And you can take it from there, Naomi, why you think this case is so important and what your thoughts were about the argument on Wednesday.
Well, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and pretty much every state in the country, reports a severe shortage of foster families. And I think that's where you have to start. I think, religious liberty is definitely, the issue that's at stake before the court. But, from my perspective, I'm coming at this from a question of how do we ensure that foster kids have as much access to as many quality foster families as possible? And Philadelphia has a great need for foster families, and Catholic Social Services has been filling this need, as the lawyers for the Becket Fund said, for a couple of hundred years now. Obviously, in this particular form, it's a little bit more recent in the sense that, foster care used to be done entirely by private agencies, and, kids were sort of funneled into a particular, usually, of course, faith-based group, and then they were sent to live with people who were from that particular faith. Now we have a situation where local governments and state governments are in charge of foster kids. They're the ones who, of course, who are charged with removing these kids from homes when they're deemed to be dangerous for one reason or another. And they're the ones who are charged ultimately with being able to find homes for them. And so the city of Philadelphia, decided a couple of years ago that it simply could not really put up with the situation in Catholic Social Services, which is that they don't place kids in same-sex homes, and they won't certify homes with same-sex couples. Now, of course, the sort of ridiculous part of this case that came up a number of times during the oral arguments Wednesday is that no same-sex couple has ever been turned down to do foster care in Philadelphia. And of course, there are many same-sex couples that do foster care. And I think there are over 24 agencies that are happy to serve them, that are happy to go into their homes to look at, their relationship, their parenting skills, and certify them to do that. And from my personal perspective, I am of the more the merrier perspective when it comes to this issue. And if there are qualified same-sex couples out there who can do this work and who clearly have been doing this work, they should be able to find an agency that meets their needs. And Catholics, like the two ladies who are represented by the Becket Fund, obviously should be able to find an agency that serves their needs as well.
I was kind of amazed at the point in the conversation during the hearings where oral arguments where Sonia Sotomayor seemed to make that point unintentionally. She said, well, of course, there are no gay couples who have come to Catholic Social Services because they would naturally go somewhere else. Hello, that's exactly the point, right?
Right. I mean, I think that this seems like a natural question for people to ask, which is, if you want, your family looks a particular way, feels a particular way, and you want to find an agency not only that will certify your family, but also that will continue to support your family in the long run. And, this is a really important point. If we lose these faith-based agencies, what will happen? And one of the things that will happen is that these couples will lose, and these, sometimes they're not couples. Sometimes they're just single women who are fostering. They will lose the support of those agencies and the kind of wraparound services that are so important, because as I've said numerous times, fostering is really hard. Up to half of couples quit doing foster care in the first year that they're doing it. So we put all of these resources into recruiting foster parents, into trying to train them, certifying their homes, and then it's just simply too much. It's overwhelming. It takes a toll on marriages, on family finances, on other siblings living in the homes. And one of the most important roles that these faith-based agencies can serve is to support those foster parents. And there's research showing that those who do use those agencies, those faith-based agencies, actually end up serving for longer as foster parents than people who don't.
So why does it seem the government is trying to make it more difficult?
Well, I think one of the problems with foster care is it's being used as a vehicle for fighting the culture wars, and you can see this in all sorts of ways now. A couple of years ago, there was kind of this weird case in Michigan that made the New York Times of I think Michigan had proposed to mandate that people who held licensed firearms in their homes could not do foster care. Had there been a problem? Had some, foster kid, been playing with a handgun? No, this was just kind of a, let's figure out a way to stick it to people who like guns. And foster care is one of those kind of government services where we, ensure that people have to apply and go through a whole lot of hoops, obviously, and for good reason, in order to serve. And so those hoops have now become different kind of touch points in the culture war. So in addition to this argument over same-sex marriage, now a number of states, including California, have required that foster families sign on to a particular set of beliefs, that you promise to support a foster child if they want to do gender transitioning, that you promise to call a foster child by his or her preferred pronoun. There was actually just a somewhat outrageous case, really, out west, where you had a child who was going to be fostered by their I think it was a great set of great grandparents. And the Washington State Department of Children's Services would not certify the great grandparents to act as foster parents because they would not sign on to some hypothetical situation where if the child wanted to do some kind of gender transitioning, that they had to promise that they would support that. And the couple were Seventh-day Adventists. And they said, not only, do we not believe this, but also this is just ridiculous. We're talking about a 3-year-old child who has shown no sign that they have any gender identity issues. And for you to stand in the way of family members caring for this child because we will not sign on to this particular social program just seems ridiculous. And fortunately, a judge threw out that decision, but I think you're going to see this coming up more and more.
Do you see any way out of this crazy situation where we have all these children who need homes, and there seem to be some who are so fixated on the child who will want a gender transition? These kids just want a chance at life, Yeah. But why? I mean, why can't people see straight? And how can we make them see straight here?
I don't know. Like I said, I keep trying to make the more the merrier argument, and I have tried to. I think the media has definitely portrayed this as a case where religious agencies are "quote unquote" discriminating against certain couples, and I think that we need to sort of make people see that this is a let a flowers bloom situation where we need to encourage as many people as possible to do this work. One way of thinking about this is really not in terms of religious freedom or in terms of the stigma against LGBT couples. It's really thinking about the rights of children. And I wrote a piece, as you know, for National Review that's in the current issue that talks about do children have the right to form family bonds? And this was the subject of an amicus brief by Generation Justice that was filed with the court in this particular case. Generation Justice, works, lobbying various ways on behalf of foster kids and kids who are at risk and in the system. And they have said that, the 14th Amendment, when it was passed, when we were talking about kind of what newly freed people deserve. And one of the things that people clearly were thinking about at the time was the right to form and keep a family. And it's clear very, very much so now that that is one of the rights that is being denied to these foster children. And it's happening in all sorts of ways. It's happening in the ways of shutting down options like faith-based agencies, but it also just happens in the bureaucracy, the incompetence of foster care agencies every day, that children are, say being cared for by a foster family for, 3 or 4 years. And then caseworkers, out of no reason or out of some desire for retaliation, they're annoyed with the foster family, rip that child away and put them someplace else. Sometimes in just another foster home. It's not even back with their biological parents. So the question is, how can we think about this in terms of, and I know conservatives are very reluctant to kind of think about, finding new rights in the Constitution, or even rights for children has been kind of a controversial issue for a number of reasons. But I think if we think about, the tremendous burden that the government has here, they're taking away children from their biological parents, then they really have to take on this additional burden of finding quality homes and doing as much as they can to make sure that children are not traumatized over and over again by the decisions of, incompetent or, just ill-meaning bureaucrats.
I was in the room for some early discussions about that amicus brief with Generation Justice, and I understand the conservative objections, but if we believe in a right to life, right, we have to follow that through, and I think this is a way to follow this through, to say that children who, Darcy Olson, the head of Generation Justice, is always talking about the kids who are born to meth addicts, who really have no choice because these parents are incapable of raising the child, and so that child has a right to get out of that situation. And I do think we need to think more in those terms. What did you think, Naomi, about one of the things that drove me crazy about some of the questioning during the oral argument was the inevitable comparison to interracial marriage? And what I kept thinking, beyond just sort of being irritated that we were having some kind of academic discussion when we're talking about children's lives, but when you look at Sharon L. Fulton, for instance, one of the plaintiffs, her life is the front lines of Black Lives Matter. The majority of the children that she has fostered are Black. She is helping give these kids a chance, as some of them testify to as adults. And I'm just sort of beside myself that people can't pay attention to that reality beyond, the surface level politics of the headlines of this case.
Yeah, I mean, the comparison with interracial marriage has all sorts of legal problems. As I think all the lawyers suggested, the burden that the court has placed, and the kind of emphasis that the court has placed on the compelling interest of the state to not, when it comes to preventing racial discrimination, is much different than the jurisprudence on same-sex marriage at this point. And who knows, maybe the jurisprudence on same-sex marriage will evolve to that point, but it's certainly not there now. But I really, it certainly annoyed me, what you're talking about, which is obviously the plaintiffs in this case, and in so many cases, especially in faith-based organizations, are really committed to ensuring the placement of kids of all races. I think that there is actually evidence that, that the Catholic Social Services does a better job than most other agencies of ensuring the placement of Black children, frankly. And so to sort of throw that fact under the bus for some kind of hypothetical, well, what if they objected to interracial marriage, seemed to me a little bit absurd. But the other thing is that, race is way too often taken into account in the placement of children, and it's taken into account by child welfare agencies themselves. They're constantly, not only talking about how the most important thing in placing a child is cultural sensitivity. They will keep a child in foster care rather than allowing for permanent adoption because the race of that child does not match the race of the potential adoptive parents. I mean, there are so many problems with racial discrimination that go on in child welfare in reality that objecting to this potential in principle just seemed to me a little bit crazy. In addition to that, I would say that, that even people, I mean, there's a guy at the College of William and Mary named James Dwyer who has written extensively about this. He recently filed a federal lawsuit on behalf of a same-sex couple who had a child in their home for 2 years, and the child was going to be removed to go live with a grandparent who had an extensive criminal record. And it was very clear to this couple that they were being discriminated against by the caseworker, who was African American, and kept objecting to the way that this lesbian couple was, doing the hair of the child in their care, as if this is, the major factor in the child's well-being, as opposed to being with a safe and loving, these two safe and loving mothers, and that it would be better to send this child to live with a criminal grandfather because, the hair would be more taken care of, or more taken care of in a culturally sensitive matter. So that was, that part of the case certainly, drove me around the bend, because it just demonstrated such a lack of understanding of what's actually going on in the child welfare system on a day-to-day basis with regard to race.
I should let our audience know that if you have questions for Naomi about the case, or for us about adoption and foster care, please put your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll be happy to integrate them into our conversation. Naomi, do you have hopes that, once this election business gets past us, this case could actually be an educational opportunity for people about how foster care works?
You mean that people will start paying attention to foster care? Yes,
Everyone will read all of your articles, all 75 of them every month.
No, it's certainly, I think, the concern about kids in foster care is a bipartisan one. I have friends on both sides of the aisle who ask me questions all the time about what is going on in our child welfare system. I don't think that you have to be a conservative or a liberal or Republican or a Democrat to care about this issue. I think what the trick is sort of getting people to look beyond, the headlines, to look beyond the, just sort of some high profile child abuse headline, or some, let's just find more backpacks for kids in foster care kind of effort, and really think about what are the things that drive, children to be removed from their homes in the first place, and also what we can do to help those people who have decided to foster and recruit more people to foster. And as I've said to you before, like I've just been blown away over the last few years by the things that so many different religious agencies across the country have done in this regard. I mean, they have completely revolutionized how we recruit for foster care. It's not just putting up a picture of a kid on the nightly news anymore and saying, hey, anybody want this kid, which of course was, ineffective and frankly a little bit offensive. But also this, so this idea of like going into churches and saying, we have kids in this zip code tonight who need a home. And that is an appeal that is much more compelling for people. I think they've done an amazing job of training, just even things like, having the training at convenient times and convenient places. Churches and faith-based agencies are much more used to trying to accommodate, people who have jobs and people who want to volunteer their time, but don't have all the time and flexibility in the world. And it's not government's job, and government has never done a very good job of trying to accommodate the needs of, of people who want to volunteer for anything. I mean, just imagine how many hours you would be willing to spend at the DMV. It's not government is not made to accommodate people. And then the last thing that, as I've said before, they've done an amazing job of doing is supporting foster parents once they've decided to do it, to create a community around people, to offer respite care, to ensure that, people have the appropriate furniture and the appropriate clothing. And if they need meals brought to them, and if the child needs to be driven to 6 different appointments and those kinds of things, faith-based agencies are so sensitive to the needs of foster parents, and they have invested so much in them that they really just kind of wrap around them in ways that make this feasible in the long term. So what I hope that this case shines a light on is just the important work that these faith-based agencies do, and the huge danger of trying to put them out of business.
You make in making that point you just did, you sort of run through a litany of all the different roles that people have to play, which I think is one of the most important parts of talking about foster care and adoption. That, you know, you don't necessarily have to be a foster parent. There are other ways to serve foster parents, to make sure that, you know, you give them a break, give them some food, give them a date night, you know. There are all lots of roles for people to play. And I think the most important point is the one that I think evangelical churches at this point in history do better than Catholic churches, for instance. Catholic churches are so institutional, they sort of assume somebody is taking care of the orphans, right? And we give money in the collection, so it must be taken care of. But evangelical churches don't have that luxury, right? And so they look around and figure out what, you know, who needs help around them. And I think they have some great models, as you talk about. What are some of your favorite models out there of faith-based initiatives?
Right. So, I mean, I've written extensively about Project 127 in Colorado. That's, of course, an evangelical ministry there that does all the things I was talking about. The Call in Arizona is an organization that does the recruitment and training. And they, you know, a lot of these organizations, you know, exist within a kind of ecosystem in the area that they are. I mean, the Arkansas is kind of a state, but it's also like a big small town too. And so all these different agencies are working together. Some of them are working on helping kids who are transitioning out of foster care, you know, who need to start living an adult life. And unfortunately, you know, they have not found a forever family. And so there are, you know, organizations that help them, you know, find housing and job training and mentorship so that they understand, you know, how to operate in the adult world. There are, you know, there are organizations that, you know, help foster kids, you know, get access to the documents that they need in order to find jobs and sort of do other official things. You know, to be a foster child, you know, trying to get a driver's license is difficult. You know, where is my birth certificate and how do I do all these things? You know, looking around, I just think a lot of these organizations are part of CAFO, which is the Christian Alliance for Orphans. And, you know, I was at their conference a couple of years ago. Their conference this year was virtual, unfortunately, but it really had the feel to me of like being in Silicon Valley. There were so many different organizations that had assumed so many different roles, and you ran into sort of these people who, you know, met each other for the first time, and, you know, one was sort of explaining the concept behind their organization. The other said, you know, well, I bet we could improve that by doing this, this, and this as well, or by adopting this technology, you know, as well. That's another, I think, area of huge growth in the evangelical world and in the foster care world right now is the use of technology to help both at the level of being able to recruit more families. You know, we're stuck somewhere in the 1970s when it comes to recruitment. You know, obviously going into churches was a big thing, but we can actually know a lot about how different foster families do. Like maybe it's, you know, empty nester suburban couples who are most likely to stay in the system. Maybe it's, you know, 20 somethings who haven't even had their first child yet. Those are the kind of things that now we have the ability with, you know, big data and algorithms to be able to crunch these numbers and do much more targeted recruitment and advertising. FaithBridge, which is an agency that's in Georgia, has really pioneered a lot of the technology here, and they're looking to offer that to other states as well. But people are also using technology for something like Care Portal, where foster families and biological families who are, you know, getting their kids back, for instance, can post needs about, you know, strollers or bunk beds or whatever it is. And instead of having a, you know, a caseworker, you know, for a government agency be tasked with finding those things, you know, they can help facilitate them, but, you know, they don't need to be running to Walmart themselves, because a lot of these things people have in their homes, and those needs get filled very quickly with Care Portal.
One of the things I always like to include in these conversations is if people are listening and thinking, yeah, we've been wondering about foster care for a while, where do you send them? I often recommend the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption or Bethany Christian Services. What's on the top of your list?
I think those are probably, the good places from a national perspective, but every state is different, and every state has, their own organizations, and different religious groups have different organizations too. So that's I think both a benefit, and also maybe more sort of something that's more difficult for people who are just kind of doing this, kind of looking into it for the first time. But I think, if you go into your, search for your state, you're likely to find a lot of these agencies that are willing to do the training and the recruitment.
Not to get too political, but I do have to just give credit where credit is due. I think Melania Trump has made an effort on these issues, but because it's the Trump administration, I think it was hard to have any kind of real bipartisan kind of feel to it. Do you have any realistic hopes that, say, we have a divided government to come, that there are some public policy issues from a national standpoint that would be helpful, that could be worked on? And isn't it also true, though, that even as I asked that question, a lot of the reforms that need to happen are on a state-by-state level?
Yeah, I go back and forth on this one. I mean, it's true that the reforms and really policy is determined on a state by state level here. I mean, the Supreme Court case we're talking about is really one of the few exceptions where issue comes to national prominence, because there are so many, there's the religious freedom is at stake. That being said, the federal government gives about half of all foster care dollars to states. And I have been saying for a long time that I wish they would use those dollars as leverage to get more of what we want out of the foster care system. Things like the enforcement of the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which really limits the amount of time that a child can spend in foster care. It was passed in the mid 90s with bipartisan consensus. This idea that a child should not be languishing in foster care, for a long period of time, and states are regularly flouting that law. The other one that I think that they regularly flout again is the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, which banned discrimination from the basis of race or ethnicity when placing children for foster care or adoption. And again, as I was saying before, this is something that is routinely flouted by states. And what you see is, maybe the federal government will sort of, say, hey, we kind of notice you're doing this, but there's no accountability. There's no point at which the federal government says, we're not going to give you the money. You're not following the law. We're not going to give you the money. And this is a very difficult, road to go down, because nobody wants to see a foster system not get money, because they think, well, the people who will be most hurt by it are the kids. But this is the leverage. This is what we have. I mean, you could also say, well, we shouldn't be, giving states money for, highways if they haven't followed the laws either. And maybe you'll have broken highways, and, something bad will happen there. But the federal government, is willing to use its power in this way in some regards, but it never does it with regard to child welfare systems. So, I think that's certainly one, maybe sort of heavy-handed way of fixing things. But I would also like to see, states really re-examine, we talked about generation justice earlier. They have, different kinds of model legislation that they have been pushing. But I was on the phone this week with a group in California called Advokids. And, they're a law firm that does, pro bono legal work for foster parents. And they get calls all the time from foster parents who are, they're trying to legally intervene in a case on behalf of a child. And they're routinely, shut out of the case, even if they've been caring for that child for years. So they have a few lawyers on staff, but they're completely overwhelmed. They have a hotline. They receive thousands of calls a year from foster parents. And so, when are the higher courts, in states going to wake up and realize what is happening in family courts is not good for these kids?
Who do you think there are likely candidates for people on the national level to use some of those levers? And who are some of the sort of outstanding public policymakers on these issues?
I mean, the person who is there, Lynn Johnson, who's the head of ACF now, has been very good on these issues. I think she's done a very good job of pushing an adoption agenda, of really trying to limit the amount of time kids are in foster care. I think she's been very good at working with faith-based groups and working with people across the aisle. I mean, I have had, certainly Democrats tell me that they really think that she's very good at this job. And I have no idea, who the Biden administration is going to put in that role. I do fear that it's someone who's going to have more of an agenda. I mean, the child welfare agenda really has been taken over in many ways by our discussion about racial disparities. And I really worry that the Biden administration, would put somebody in there, whose entire agenda would be, ending racial disparities in foster care. And unfortunately, that's not something we can do at the level of child welfare without putting, kids, who are African American in danger. There are simply disparate rates of child abuse in this country. You're about twice as likely to be abused as a Black child as you are as a white child. And so, you could say, well, we need to, change the disparities in foster care, but that's going to mean leaving a lot more abused Black kids in their homes.
And how big of a problem do you think is the LGBT ideology and gender fluidity? I'm sort of shocked by the number of times that this comes up in conversations about child welfare.
So,
I mean, obviously is a worry for me in the Biden administration.
I think there are two separate issues here. I mean, like I said, I think that, all of the country, you see LGBTQ folks who are, interested in fostering and adopting. They're often, on average, they tend to be people of higher income levels than same-sex couples. They tend to be, well educated and people who are, able to provide permanent, safe, loving homes for kids. And one of the things that I think we need to think about is how do we encourage those kind of people to stay in the system? Because it's very frustrating, frankly, if you're a person with a reasonable level of income and a job and educated to deal with a system that feels like the DMV all the time. And I have interviewed many gay couples about their experience and how insane it makes them to deal with this. And I think it's so important to keep those people in the system and not just because they're providing these loving homes, but also as a check on the insanity of the system. I mean, suddenly when you have someone in family court who knows their rights as a foster parent and who understands what children are supposed to be treated like, and who knows when a judge is sort of not doing their job, and who knows when a caseworker is not doing a job, and who knows when children are not being receiving the services that they're supposed to receive under the system. Those are the people we need acting as a check on this. So, I would not, I would not want to take away from that at all. The question about, how we are dealing with LGBTQ youth in the system, I think another question. I think, sometimes there are cases in which, we're overestimating the number of these kids who are in the system. I think you get a sort of typical narrative of, a gay kid who is, not fitting in, some horrible, fundamentalist parent has kicked them out of their house, and that's how they ended up in foster care. And who is going to take in this child? I think that's still a pretty small minority of the kids who are in the system, frankly. We definitely need to figure out a way to care for those kids, lovingly, and make sure that they are in permanent, stable settings too. Often those kids have a huge number of psychological problems, and especially with the kids who are, who say that they are, were born into the wrong body. I think that there are a lot of things that we need to be thinking about before this question of whether we should be giving them hormones or surgery. Right. Even in that, I mean, there's a lot of talk about the rights of biological parents in this whole discussion. And, I think you can sort of see both sides of that. But foster care is supposed to be temporary. And to imagine that your child is going to go into foster care and that somebody, in the foster care system, the foster parent supporting and the state essentially authorizing surgery to change your child's gender. And then that child is returned to you. Like, I just think we're so overstepping our bounds in terms of the government's power here that it's really unconscionable. And I do hope people will sort of wake up and think, our role here really has to be, first, do no harm.
Right.
And you cannot, you cannot think that this is not going to have consequences in terms of what the reaction of biological parents is going to be, when they are hopefully reunified with those children.
Well, I mean, I think any gender transition for children is basically child abuse. And I think that we have to look at all these factors that you're talking about, Naomi. I had a conversation a couple of months ago with a man who was in foster care, and he was abused as a child. And he was very open about the fact that he's been confused all his life because of all of this. So why would we, as adults, push ideological beliefs on these poor kids who are, whatever has happened to them, they are suffering and they are hurt. And can we just start there and not push all of this ideological stuff on them? Yeah.
And I would say, leaving that just, that sort of hot button issue aside, many of these parents complain about just the dearth of, psychological counseling that is available for these kids, and how they have to fight tooth and nail with the agency to be able to get the kid to see a therapist on a regular basis. Let alone, this, can I find someone to gender transition this child? Like, just weekly, cognitive behavioral, talk therapy, is almost impossible for these parents to get. And I think they're deeply frustrated. And, again, this is a question where I think, conservatives would generally agree. You could say the government shouldn't be spending lots of money on X, Y, or Z, but these are our most vulnerable kids, and the government has taken them out of their homes, and it now becomes our responsibility as the government, as taxpayers, to be able to serve these kids well. Because frankly, if for nothing else, the practical reason, the results of these kids who are not, who are not helped, are horrendous. They end up being much more of a burden on the system the other end. I hate to think about it just in terms of money, but in terms of the prison population, the homeless population, the mental illness when they get to be adults, it's just problems that we need to be tackling and thinking about much earlier on.
I'm pretty certain I screamed at my C-SPAN feed the other day when at some point the conversation during the oral arguments came about private prisons, and I'm like, can we keep these kids from going to prison? Kids who will purposely get themselves arrested so they have somewhere to sleep, eat, and shower, could we talk about that?
Yeah.
What in writing about these things and having conversations with people, what is it that you think that holds people back from paying more attention to this, keeping this from being a more serious top line national issue for people?
Well, whatever else you think, it is a relatively small portion of the population. There and from my perspective, that means it's an issue that should be solved much more quickly and much more easily. It's not
we can
not
do
Middle East peace or whatever. There are about 500,000 kids who are in foster care, and and I think obviously we live in a country where it's very easy to go through your entire middle class life without ever encountering someone who's in that situation. So we do live in these kind of self-segregating communities, and the families that are most likely to be affected from this have, as we know, in recent years just become totally disconnected from churches, from schools, from neighborhood institutions where they would come into contact with people who have more resources. And that's one of the things that I really appreciate about some of these faith-based agencies too. Just to go back to Arkansas for a minute, the call is operating in like 75% of the counties in Arkansas. That's some of these places are so rural, and people are so disconnected from their communities that I think it's a real credit to them to be able to say that they went into all of these places and they were able to find volunteers in every single one of these communities who were willing to do the kind of outreach that's necessary for this issue. So that's definitely part of it. You just don't encounter these kids. And I think a secondary reason is why don't people do foster care? And one reason is that it's very hard for many middle and upper middle class American families to imagine taking a troubled child into their home. It's not that they don't care. It's that, the way we sort of think about parenting now is much different from what would be required to take care of one of these kids. Like, think about your church, think about your synagogue. Are there kids in those places who have experienced severe trauma, who are likely to have outbursts, who are likely to, be hitting themselves? I mean, we talk about, how kids with Down syndrome are unseen these days, how few kids, we see in these communities, who have severe problems. And I think that, the idea that a family is going to purposefully take in one of these children, I think really makes people very fearful. And it also makes people wonder, like, how I don't even know how to parent this child. Like, all I know how to parent is getting better SAT scores and, trying to prepare this child for college and helicopter extracurricular activities. And so there's a different vision of parenting that has to be there when you're thinking about fostering or adopting out of foster care.
Which I think, and you've written more broadly about parenting, I think could be a really great gift to America, frankly, to have like take a few steps back, have a more sort of humble expectation for family life. And you don't necessarily have to have all the activities. And you can, I mean, if maybe one of the mercies of this quarantine time, it's driven people crazy, but it also has allowed for families to be together more, for better or for worse, but I hope for better in some regards. And certainly from a perspective of people from faith-based backgrounds, we talk about the widow and orphan in Christianity all the time. And so that has to mean something. That has to be some kind of call to us, it would seem.
Yeah, I would say so. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that, some of these agencies have really reported an uptick in the number of volunteers they have had during this time of COVID. I mean, I know this is a weird kind of, thing to think about. And for a lot of families, like, would encourage them to even be more protective and sort of to retreat inside their bubble even more because, God forbid they come into contact with a child who has COVID or have to arrange visitation with biological parents who have COVID, like to expand their circle at this time seems counterintuitive. But, I was talking to the head of CAFO the other day during an AEI event, and he was talking about, like, they've had people who normally do traveling for work and things like that. And they've, realized, well, they're grounded for the foreseeable future. So this is something where they feel like they could take on this responsibility now in a way that they couldn't before. And people, of course, also see like the needs are really there, or, and technology has also allowed them to do more of this training via video conference, and to find out more about these alternatives, using technology. Obviously, you can't be a foster parent virtually, but there are certain aspects of this that are, very burdensome in terms of the, upfront training and things like that, that I think some private agencies and also, frankly, government agencies are realizing can be done virtually. We had on a family court judge, former family court judge, who was talking about, how many of these hearings now are taking place virtually, and frankly, how much better that is in terms of getting people's participation.
I have been amazed. I actually was watching a friend of mine get final, the couple get final processing of their children over FaceTime or whatever it was, and yeah, the possibilities are great. On the other hand, we also know, and how much of a handle do we have on this even yet? How many more kids need foster care because of this time? Not being seen by schools has been a huge factor, and we've heard that there are fewer reports in for people who need foster care just because the schools haven't been seeing kids.
Yeah, I think you've seen definitely a big uptick. What you're seeing is a downtick in the number of reports, but possibly an uptick in the amount of abuse and neglect that's going on because of not only the stress that parents are experiencing, but also you're seeing, drug problems that happen to people, when they are isolated. Sometimes there are problems that are just recurring, that they already had before. But the stress of the pandemic has definitely made the substance abuse issues worse, and we can see that in the overdose deaths and suicide attempts and things like that. So I think, parents, definitely people look around them and they see that there is more of a need. And I think you're going to see that even more as schools begin to open up and we find out more about what these cases. So you see kind of like maybe there's kind of been a downturn in the need, or it seems, but then once things start opening up, we're going to uncover some of the things that have gone wrong over the last several months, and we're going to need to be filling those needs, both in terms of investigations and agency intervention, but also in terms of the need for foster parents to help care for these kids, many of whom have been really severely traumatized by what's been going on.
Well, Naomi Riley, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for all the work that you're doing in this field. I want to thank everyone who's listening now or will be listening later. And we will have future episodes of this Free to Foster Friday series next week, most likely with Lori Wyndham from the Beckett Fund and Monty Alvarado, to talk in more depth about the Philadelphia case and the families who are really being affected by the breakage of contract. Again, Naomi Schaefer Riley, you can find her at the American Enterprise Institute. Read everything she has to write about foster care and adoption and child welfare, and it is a lot.
Thanks so much, Kathryn.
All right, take care. And thank you on behalf of the National Review Institute for